In this episode, I am joined by Dr. Francisco José Luis, scholar of Indo-Iranian studies and comparative religion, trained at the Sorbonne, Paris, and SOAS, London. Francisco recalls his upbringing and education in Luxembourg, details his rigorous academic training in classical languages such as Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, and laments what he sees as the rise of ideological indoctrination in modern education. Francisco discusses his PhD in pre-reformist Sikhism, his years of fieldwork living in the Punjab, and expresses his love of the German intellectual tradition. Francisco reveals the influence of Neo-Platonism on Islamic theology and mysticism, describes his own turn to Shiʿi Islam, and explains why he believes that even today there is a living lineage of Neoplatonism that stretches directly back to Plotinus. So without further ado, Dr. Francisco José Luis. Dr. Francisco José Luis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Very honored to be here with you. I'm a big fan of this podcast, so I'm very honored to be on this podcast with you.
Thank you very much, and the honor is also mine. I can assure you, we've had a bit of a private correspondence for, months, maybe a year or two, who knows, something like that. And you've been regularly updating me about various research that you've been conducting, comparative studies of Tantra and Muslim techniques, really fascinating stuff, and we'll get into that. But first, let's begin with your life. I'm curious about the context of your upbringing, and I know you've had a very interesting religious journey. So I'm curious about really two things, I suppose: your religious journey personally, but also your academic journey, and how those two things have unfolded and related to each other.
Well, so I was born in Luxembourg. For those who don't know, it's that small country that is situated between Belgium, Germany, and France. And it's also a country that has a reputation of being extremely rich. Let me just reassure you, it's not the case. Not everyone in Luxembourg, is driving 2 or 3 cars. So I'm the son of Portuguese immigrants who migrated to Luxembourg in the early 70s. My father had just come back from the war, and basically there was a shortage of workers in Luxembourg. So my father migrated to Luxembourg, and then eventually my mother migrated with him there as well. And I was born there in 1975. And I have to say that I feel very blessed to have been able to grow up in Luxembourg at a time when education was actually still very good in Luxembourg. There was a certain anti-Americanism amongst the teaching the teaching profession in Luxembourg, and most of the politicians in Luxembourg in those days used to be teachers. So a lot of the reforms that that were being basically imposed on us were being circumvented, so that as a working class kid, as the son of a construction worker, I was able to have a fantastic education. I was able to do the classics in secondary school, study Latin for 6 years, Greek as well. So I have a very solid training in the humanities even before entering the university. And I was very lucky to be amongst those kids who had teachers who actually had been educated before World War II. And it was really interesting, but that generation, especially the teachers teaching the classics, were people who, would learn 10 languages, for example. There was one professor, there was one teacher at our secondary school, Mr. Krippler, who was teaching Latin and Greek, and who basically also knew Tibetan, Chinese, and Japanese, right? So actually I approached him, because I wanted to learn Sanskrit. And I was in secondary school, and he advised I'd contact Mr. Robert Koch, who was a teacher of Latin and Greek, but in the capital of Luxembourg, which is half an hour away from my house. And so during my last year of secondary school, I would go to his house, every Saturday, and he would teach me Sanskrit. And he would do this in this very old German way of this emphasis on, rigorous knowledge of grammar, of syntax, and really going into the depth of these texts. And of course, for me, that was, I was elated by this experience, because I was receiving very, very good quality. Extremely amazing. Amazing quality teaching from this teacher. But while at the same time exploring these texts that I've been wanting to explore for quite a while, because I had developed, since the age of 11, 12, I had developed this fascination for ancient India. And so finally, I was able to, after a few months, I was able to read Sanskrit texts in the original, and that was really wonderful. But beyond that, we were taught 4 years of philosophy in secondary school, the history of art, history of music. We came out of secondary school with a wonderful, humanistic sort of culture, all-round humanistic culture. And thanks to those teachers, also a certain opening to other civilizations. My Sanskrit teacher, Mr. Koch, was also very proficient in classical Japanese. So he would always give me these extra copies that he had of texts that he had around, and he would give these lectures about the Genji Monogatari, for example, the great Japanese epic. And so it was just wonderful, traveling mentally with this wonderful man who never charged me a single penny. And that was the purity of things in those days. That it wasn't done out of financial interest. This was really a guru shishya sort of relationship, and I still have towards him the reverence one has towards one's Gurudev as a sort of second father figure. Thank God I actually had other mentors like that throughout my life, and I feel very blessed that I was able to grow up in that country, and which also gave me the ability to have a classical musical education as well. And so in many ways, I think that my journey would not have been like that had my parents not migrated to Luxembourg. And yeah.
You mentioned that there was an anti-American sentiment in Luxembourg. I'm curious if you could expand on the relevance of that and the implications of that. And then I'd like to return to a couple of other questions, but let's start there.
Yeah. Well, I think for Luxembourg in particular, I think a great deal of the population is actually of German origin to start with. So there was already that. During the Second World War, Luxembourg was actually included in the Third Reich. And the official version of history is that, of course, everyone resisted, and that's actually not entirely true. My own hometown gave 300 volunteers to the Waffen SS, but at the same time, there were also the equal amount of people who resisted the German authorities. Not so much because they disagreed with the anti-communist policies, but simply because the Germans simply denied the independence of Luxembourg. The Luxembourgish people are very aware of the fact that they're Germanic peoples, and they have no problem with that. Luxembourg is the only country that still has a dialect of Frankish as its official language. Frankish is a German, it's a cousin of German, and so Luxembourgish people are fully aware that they're part of the wider Germanic community. What they didn't like is the way in which basically the German military authorities decided to scrap our borders and included us in basically what was later on known as the Moselgau, which is the region around Trier, the German city of Trier, and tried to basically erase our distinct Luxembourgish, identity. This is what people resented. So it's complicated. But what people also didn't like was the fact that the Americans behaved in Europe pretty much as if it was a conquered country, and a lot of people who lived during the war were very well aware of exactions that were committed by the Allied forces against the civilian population, which is never talked about. Civilians being rounded up and being marched, over minefields, or women who had fallen in love with German officers and then being the target of horrible treatment. So people have this, very mixed feelings about the American presence. While many people basically thank the Americans for having freed them from the horrible Germans, they resent the cultural invasion that came with the occupation of Europe afterwards, which is this whole export culture that America forced upon Europe through legal means, because there were quotas there's a certain percentage of songs that had to be American, a certain percentage of movies that had to be American, and so forth, and people resented that. And there was a lot of resistance against that. I mean, people were glad to be independent again, but they resented the German occupier as much as they resented the American occupation. They wanted to keep their culture, and especially the humanistic, classical European culture that they had, preserved for so many centuries, and that's where the resentment, comes from. And yeah.
And so, what were the implications then for your education?
Well, the implications was that my teachers and much of the Ministry of Education at that time resisted attempts to basically give up cursive writing. So I still write. So I was able to learn cursive writing. We had calligraphy classes. We'd use the fountain pen, and to this very day, I still only use fountain pen. I consider ballpoint pens to be a heresy that will lead you to eternal damnation. And actually, to this very day, I force all of my students to learn the cursive script and to use fountain pens to discipline their handwriting. I think that having a beautiful handwriting is a sign of mercy and loving kindness towards the other person who's reading what you've written. So we were still able to learn that, and so like 10 years after I left primary school, that's when these new changes came, and children were taught the printed scripts instead of the cursive script, and that brought about a whole range of catastrophes in terms of children not being able to recognize letters and confusing letters, and of course the horrible handwriting that comes with learning the printed script in combination with using the ballpoint pen. That is why, I mean, whenever I'm mentoring someone, I insist on people learning the cursive script and using a fountain pen only, and that's one of the obligatory components of the contract that I have with people that I mentor, because and in the beginning they moan, but later on they realize that it's it's actually a beautiful thing because you know, writing in cursives has so many benefits. Sorry, that's an an electricity cut. But okay, it's back. So we've got a replacement. We've got one of these bulbs that you know, gets charged and then, you know.
Mm.
So where was I before? I was talking about cursive.
Well, I'd asked you about this anti-American sentiment and the influence it had, the implications it had for your education. You started off saying cursive was one of them, art history.
Yeah. And of course, there was also the fact that, you know, our teachers put a great deal of emphasis upon, you know, upon critical thinking. So and a lot of my teachers would tell me, you know, we're trying to give you the keys to your own intellectual independence. What you do with it is up to you. You know, later on, if you disagree with our ideas, that's fine. But what's really important is that you question everything. And so they gave us the tools, you know, so to do that. So we learned logic. We learned formal logic in secondary school, along with, you know, philosophy. And that is, I'm eternally grateful for that, because it taught us really to question authority, and that for me has been I mean, when I compare the type of education I received, you know, and the one that other people receive in other countries, I'm very grateful that basically my teachers were, you know, self-declared, you know, pains in the ass, you know, because they really wanted us to be intellectually independent, and I'm very grateful for that.
This might be a bit of a, you know, if you haven't thought about this, then, you know, we'll move on to something else. But you're talking about an educational reform that was resisted, and that you received a type of education that was, you know, that eventually did give way to this new style. I wonder if you might differentiate the two modes of education. Do you know where this reform came from? What was its intention? I'm curious if you've tracked all that.
I only started really looking into that very recently. So I'm not in a position where I can, you know, make statements that I would be happy with in terms of the correctness of what I'm going to state. But I think that first of all, there's a generational difference that I noticed, which is that the teachers, the excellent teachers that I had, were mostly all educated before or during World War II, and they had this amazing classical culture, but also this great interest towards, you know, towards other civilizations. Where things started getting really terrible in my eyes was when this whole generation of boomers started becoming teachers, and all these people who, you know, went through the whole 1960s, you know, revolution. And this is where I found that ideological indoctrination was being pushed on us. And so that I started having teachers who were extremely anti-religious, aggressively secular, and who really pushed agendas that had no place in school, you know. And so I really resented that. And I asked myself where that came from. And I think that it had to do a lot with, you know, a generational difference. As to whether or not this was policy at that time, I have no definite answer, because I've not had time to fully look into it. But when I compare what I was learning with those boomer teachers and the program that, you know, students had in East Germany at that time, it was practically the same. And that for me is a big problem, because especially in my case, I was being I wouldn't say bullied, but harassed by my teachers because I had, already back then I was known to have a great deep passion and for religions in general, but also for the Catholic tradition, and that was that really made my experience of secondary school extremely sour, because on the one hand, I had these amazing teachers who, these pre-World War II teachers were absolutely amazing, who were, treasure troves of knowledge. And then on the other hand, I had these boomers who were very sloppy ideologues who were trying to shove, something down my soul that I just didn't want. And so not just I didn't want, but it just had no place in secondary school, because there's a whole range of authors that I only later on discovered, because, for example, in German literature we would only read Bertolt Brecht. It was every single year Bertolt Brecht. There's a whole range of amazing German writers that are really worth reading, and that nobody talked to me about in secondary school. People like, for example, Ernst Jünger, who was a celebrated writer of the 1930s, and I never heard his name in secondary school, even though he wrote one of the most amazing books of the first half of the 20th century. This is where I recognize that there were these problems, and but yeah, for me it translated itself in attempt by my teachers to basically ideologically format me, to the point that they would call my parents to school and then tell them, well, there's a problem with your kid. It's like, what is it? Well, is it the marks? Well, no, he has excellent marks. So what's this problem? Well, he keeps reading these books about Buddhism and Hinduism and mysticism and so on and so forth. And, you shouldn't allow that. So they actually convinced my parents to actually confiscate all of my books at some point, right? And that's East German, communism. And so I a bit, it was a terrible experience, but at the same time, I'm glad I had it, because I can sort of relate to people who lived during that regime.
What changed between that pre-World War generation and the boomers?
I think it's something it's something I'm still exploring. I mean, the boomers. I mean, and my parents are boomers, so I'm not going to put everyone in that category. But there's been this amongst the boomers. There's this this idea that European civilization is basically at its very core just evil, and that it needs to be obliterated and replaced by something new, right? And what it's so it can manifest itself in different ways. It can be consumerism, so that's the American export culture. It can also manifest itself in ideologies that challenge, the European philosophical and spiritual tradition. And so I think that, the Second World War was such a shock, civilizational shock. I always think of the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna tells Krishna about his reluctance to go to war with, his cousin clan, the Kauravas, right? And then he says, well, if we all kill each other on this battlefield, what will be the result? The result will be the degeneracy, throughout society. The pollution of the varnas, of the classes, and the complete destruction of the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal Dharma. And in a certain way, what happened in Europe sort of validates what Arjuna says in the Bhagavad Gita, because this was a brothers' war, right? This was a war between Europeans killing each other, whilst at the same time preaching to the whole world that they were the brightest civilization that ever existed. And so that, of course, created a deep wound I think, in the European consciousness. And then, of course, the boomers, I mean, a great part of the boomers, basically, and especially those who went through that influence of the American export culture, felt that the old world needed to be replaced. And so, whilst there were problematic elements about European culture before the war, what happened is that the baby was being thrown out with the bathwater. And so, I mean, it's really problematic when you have people telling you that they refuse to listen to Richard Wagner, because Richard Wagner was supposedly, the favorite composer of the Nazis. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? So, and I mean, Richard Wagner is one of my favorite composers. I mean, there's nothing like the euphoria of playing the overture of Tannhäuser. There's this Odinic trance you go into when you're playing it. When you're in the orchestra playing it, there's this. I mean, I've got goosebumps just talking about it. It's such an entrancing piece of music. And then just to come along and say, well, we have to get rid of Wagner because it's this evil Nazis, whatever. And I'm just like, this is just really ridiculous. I mean, it's a generation that decided to cut ties with the classical European tradition, and people like me were basically left orphaned because of that stupid decision of theirs.
You mentioned a few relics, if you like, educational relics that you received, grounding in Latin, Greek, formal logic, and so on. I wonder, but you've also mentioned that there was a bit of a deficit too, which you had to fill in later. For example, German literature, and so on. So I'm curious if you might say something a bit about that. If you might take an inventory of what you did get, because you did get some things, and they seem to be very valuable to you, and what you feel was a deficit, and how it was that you went on to address that later on.
Well, so I developed this very interesting trait, which is that, and this is very curious, but I've started. I mean, already whilst I was in the education system, I started to realize, especially with that generation of teachers, the boomers, that I couldn't just trust what they were saying. So I had to basically look beyond the official discourse. And this happened to me because as an altar boy, I was serving at Mass, and the church I used to serve as an altar boy. It was the St. Joseph Church in my hometown. The walls of the church were all gray, right? But one day during Mass, I noticed behind the statue of the Blessed Virgin that there were cracks in the paint. And so after Mass, I went behind the statue and I started chipping off the gray paint. And then I discovered that there were these wall paintings that had been covered up in gray paint. And what's really interesting is that, so I asked people, and what is this? So I had two versions of the story. And one version is like, well, the bloody Nazis came here and they bludgeoned everything with gray paint. And I'm like, okay, what's the other version? The other version, which actually is the correct one, is that after Vatican II, the Archbishop of Luxembourg decided we had to demystify Catholicism. So all of the statues of the saints were basically brought upstairs in the organ chamber, and all of the walls that were covered in these like exquisite neo-Gothic wall paintings were basically covered in this insipid gray paint that was, you know, so what this episode for me, it just initiated this trend in me not to trust official narratives and to look for the cracks in the paint. And so, I mean, you know, so I received an amazing education. But whatever I did not receive, I just deduced from, you know, from the absence of certain things that were not being taught to me that, you know, there were other authors. So I would consult these histories of German literature or French literature, and then look for the authors that, you know, my teachers would not talk about. So, you know, and my golden rule is, you know, if a boomer teacher does not tell you about a specific author, there are great chances that this actually might be a wonderful author. So I ended up, you know, reading, you know, Rainer Maria Rilke and Ernst Jünger and, you know, and all of these chaps. And, you know, I'm very happy that I sort of developed that rule, which is that if there's a silence about a specific thing, you know, just like in the myth of the Grail, right? So you know, when it's where the forest is the darkest that the knight has to go and search for the Grail. So yeah, so I developed that sort of instinct to look in directions where, you know, there was silence. And I think there's a key here to, you know, like, you know, if there's silence, that's where the good stuff is.
I wonder if you might say a little more about your religiosity at this pre-university period. You're an altar boy there. You have an interest in world religions and so on.
Yeah.
Did you have a personal religious sense? Were you ever tempted to become a priest or something along those lines? How did it play out at that time?
Oh, well, it's very interesting. I think in retrospective, I think that I would say that I grew up as what we call in German a Heidenchrist, a pagano-Christian. In the sense that I've always had the sense of the existence of God, the divine, right? There's never been a second in my life where I actually doubted the existence of God. And also, I've never understood the category of religion. For me, it's all one. You know, arts, ritual, music, sexuality, knowledge, food, all of that is just part of the path, basically. So already back then, I had this conviction. But most importantly, is that yes, I mean, I grew up officially as Catholic, but my Catholicism was deeply pagan, in the sense that I grew up since the age of 8, really, with a deep interest in mythology. And so in my mind, I constructed this idea that, you know, there's Christ, who's the face of the living God. Then all the pagan deities are manifestations of the Logos before, you know, Christ incarnates on earth. So I'd find myself in the evening, you know, addressing Jesus as, you know, Christ Zeus or Jesus Zeus, and you know. And this was, I mean, I noticed it last year. I remember an episode from my childhood. I was very small. There's a thunderstorm, and I've since I was a child, I was always fascinated by thunderstorms. And so I asked my father, it's like, you know, look, what is this thing that happened yesterday? So my father goes like, well, that was a thunderstorm. I'm like, but what's a thunderstorm? And it's like, well, when Jesus is not happy with humanity, he just provokes these thunderstorms. And now I'm thinking back, and I'm like, that's that's ancestral memory. That's four. You're describing the gods of our ancestors, basically. And so, so I grew up with this. I grew up as a good Catholic. I did my first communion, the confirmation. After the confirmation, I became an altar boy quite late in my teens. Whilst at the same time I was practicing, I was learning meditation, basically. So I had this sort of, how to put this, pagano, Neo-Vedantic / Catholicism thing going on. So yeah, that was I used to have these very interesting discussions with my parish priests. And I always say that, had my parish priest been Father Francis Tiso, who's this Tibetologist who wrote this amazing book on rainbow body, I think I would probably have remained a Catholic. Unfortunately, I was not lucky from that point of view. Also because I happen to know him as well. He's a fantastic human being. But yeah, so that's how that's how my Catholicism was. I would say I was very devout, and I would go to mass every Sunday. But at the same time at home, I would be practicing meditation, from learning it from books, like the books by Swami Shivananda, for example. Or, I used to read a lot of material by Swami Vivekananda and the life of Sri Ramakrishna. And of course, and that's the thing that initiated all of that, is at the age of 11, I read the life story of Lord Buddha. And that changed everything. That really changed everything. That, and having my first copy of the Bhagavad Gita around the age of 14, 15, I think, or 16, I can't remember. But yeah, that was life changing. And so I sort of developed this personal theology where Christ is the manifestation of God, but there's also Krishna, and there's also other people or avatars, and so I became how to put it, I became a nice heretic, like Catholic in practice but heretic in belief, I guess.
You're part of a long tradition of Catholics like that.
Yeah, thank God. It's like
what happened next with your educational journey? Is this when you went to France?
Yeah, so I was initially accepted at the University of Freiburg in Germany, which had an excellent, we still have an excellent Indology department. So I wanted to study in Germany because I really liked the rigor and quality of German education. There was, however, one problem, which is that I come from a working class background, and my parents really insisted on the fact that my parents would say, well, you can study Indology if you want, but please also study something that might enable you to have a normal job, just in case the Indology stuff doesn't work out. So I wanted to be in a university where I could do 2 BAs simultaneously, separately, like not combined as it's the case in the Anglo-Saxon system, but 2 separate BAs and 2 separate MAs. That was not possible in the German system, but that was possible in the French system. So I went to the Sorbonne and basically registered as a student in 2 separate departments, doing 2 separate diplomas at the same time. So I have 2 BAs from the Sorbonne and 2 separate master's degrees from the Sorbonne. So it's one in basically French and comparative literature, and the other one in Indo-Iranian studies. Yeah. And so that's how I ended up in Paris, although initially I wanted to study in Germany, because I'm a bit of a, I mean, I love French. I love French literature, but there's something in my soul, I guess, that really loves classical German culture. There's something to it that it's...
And how was it at the Sorbonne?
It was hard. I mean, the literature bit was easy. That wasn't the hard part. But the Indology department was held by people who came from this very rigorous, academic background, where they just assumed that if you joined the department that you had already studied Greek in secondary school. And so what you'd have is, at the beginning of the year, you'd have 20 students, like 75% of them would be like these hippies. And then at the end of the year, you'd have 5 who would be the ones who actually were really serious about Indology. And I have to say, I mean, our department was really great because we had a fantastic Sanskrit teacher, Mrs. Marie-Claude Porcher. She won't believe the words I'm going to say now, but because God knows I've been a terrible student. But she was a specialist of Kavya Sanskrit, of poetic Sanskrit. So her entire emphasis was just grammar, figures of speech, textual analysis. There was none of this esoteric stuff going on at all, like in her courses. And then the other courses we had would be, Hindu law. For 2 years, we were studying, legal texts, the Dharma Shastras, and then also sociology. And then we had 1 or 2 courses about Indian spirituality, but that was not the main components. We were studying India as a civilization, and we were studying Sanskrit first and foremost as a literary language, not just as a way of accessing esoteric teachings, which and I'm glad I went through that training because sometimes you get into this sort of I call it the Kula Shaker galaxy, vibe, and you forget that, Sanskrit is also a literary language that comes with a specific discipline, Sanskrit literature isn't just the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. There's a whole range of wonderful texts in Sanskrit that have nothing to do with spirituality, and that you should know them. That it's very important to know these things because you don't want to be I mean, you really want to take that civilization seriously, and not just basically project your fantasies about Indian spirituality in your studies. So I'm really glad that it was very down to earth and very and very rigorous. And we on Tuesday mornings from 8 to 3. We would just study these, we would be reading the Valmiki Ramayana in Sanskrit. That's in the second year of Sanskrit. We'll be reading the Valmiki Ramayana and not just translating, but look into, the figures of speech and the beauty of the text actually as literature, And I think I'm very grateful for that, Do
you recall what your thesis subjects were for those 2 master's programs?
Yeah, so for my French and comparative literature master's, my thesis was the biographies that Romain Rolland and Christopher Isherwood wrote about Sri Ramakrishna. And so the trend of Neo-Vedanta amongst European and Western authors between the 2 world wars, this whole boom of interest in Vedanta, because Romain Rolland was a major French author, And he wrote this really amazing biography of Sri Ramakrishna. And I mean, that's how I discovered Sri Ramakrishna. And so I did my master's thesis in French and comparative literature about that. And then my other master's thesis was about Sikhism before the Reform, which is a subject that very few people have approached because of the difficulties that are attached to it, both linguistically, but also the subject in itself can be quite tough and controversial. Yeah.
And you were to take that on then to PhD level at SOAS.
Yeah, absolutely. So I moved to SOAS under the direction of Professor Christopher Shackle, who's just an amazing scholar. I used to go into his office, depressed, and then just come out with this newfound vigor. I mean, the PhD is a degree that is just riddled with guilt. So it was like going to his office was like going to confession, really. But yeah, so my thesis was about the Sikh orders, the Sikh monastic or semi-monastic orders. There are 4 of them that constitute sort of the organized body of the Sikh tradition before the reformist movement that took over the Sikh institutions in the 1920s and completely rewrote Sikhism as a sort of I would call it like Indian Anglicanism, basically. It's a religion of respectable taxpayers. Instead of warrior poets and this sort of stuff. So I talked a lot about the sanitization of the Sikh tradition, and so in those days I used to live among the Sikhs. And so I used to keep the long uncut hair. I used to wear kirpan, the dagger, and the turban and everything. I was really considering taking Amrit, the Khalsa initiation, not from the reformists, but actually from the Nahangs, the warrior saints of the Sikh tradition. And but unfortunately, it didn't come to that. I went on another path, but. Yeah, this PhD, I had to learn Punjabi on my own. So I took a grammar, took a dictionary. I went to live in a village in the Punjab, and that's how I taught myself Punjabi. And it was a very intense experience because, on the one hand, I was unearthing a tradition that had been occulted for like 150 years. By both Western scholarship, but also by the reformists. And at the same time, whilst doing that, I was getting into a lot of trouble in terms of, people threatening me, and someone even petrol bombed the car they thought I was in, stuff like that. And so whilst this was going on, I had these very intense experiences that normally you don't go through if you're doing a PhD in Oriental studies, right? But yeah, if you receive serious death threats, it's a moment. It's a moment where you start to really discover who you are and what you're capable to basically to take in terms of ordeals and so on and so forth. And thank God I managed to go through that experience rather physically speaking unscathed. Of course, it leaves wounds, and I think I parted ways for 15 years with the Sikh world, and I've just recently reconciled with a lot of my friends from that time, and it's a beautiful reconciliation that took place. And as you know, I went back to the Punjab, this August, and from the first to the last day, it was nothing but a wonderful, wonderful experience. I'm so glad I went back. It was very moving for me. Punjab is a region I'm very fond of. There's 2 countries there's two parts of the world I'm very fond of. One of them is, of course, Punjab, and of course, Iran as well. So yeah, but that's another story. But yeah, that was my PhD. I hope to be able to publish it next year with a reputable publisher, because from some strange reason, last year I started receiving these messages from these young Sikhs from the UK who knew about my work. And they were telling me that, it inspired them to basically look into these ancient traditions. And so they're reconnecting now to this sort of traditionalist Sikhism. And so, yeah, it seems that at least in the diaspora communities and even in India, this old school Sikhism is basically resurfacing. And so that publishing the thesis now won't have any negative consequences on my life anymore. So that's good.
I'm curious what negative consequences it might have had before, do you think? And but I'm also curious in some of what you discovered. This pre-Reformation Sikhism. What were its characteristics? What might we be surprised to know about it? And what is resonating particularly in what you found with young Sikhs, say, in the UK?
That's a really great question. So, well, the consequences were I was receiving physical death threats. I was having people telling me that they would basically get rid of me. One of my friends, who's a colleague, was doing a similar PhD at the University of Birmingham, and she nearly got shot in India. And he escaped with a broken tooth from a fight he was in. So these were serious death threats. So yeah, but now that's just, these people are basically out of the circuit, and the type of Sikhism that young people are interested in now in the Sikh community is basically the stuff that I've been, not just me, but my dear colleague, friend, and brother, Baba Kamarup Singh from the University of Birmingham. So both of us were basically the sort of pioneer figures, so to speak, in terms of looking beyond or behind the layer of paint of reformist Sikhism and cracking the paint and discovering the wall paintings behind it, so to speak. If I have to use the example I used at the beginning of this interview, and so that sort of danger is not there anymore. So that, thank God. And the good thing is that young people, especially in the UK, but also in Canada, are sort of fed up with the with reformist Sikhism, because what happened is that reformist Sikhism was an answer to the British colonialism, because Sikhs initially, when the Khalsa, the military order of the Khalsa, appeared in 1699, the idea was that we're going to create an island of Satyuga, of the age of truth, within the Kali Yuga to protect the saints, right? And then suddenly the British come along and conquer Punjab and destroy that dream. And then Sikhs start to ask themselves, well, why did this happen? And what then happens is that, thanks to the influence of Protestant missionaries, the sort of like biblical narrative of the Israelites have been worshiping idols, therefore the Lord has been punishing them with, bringing in the Babylonians and the Assyrians. So that narrative started to basically influence, the young Sikh minds that were being brought up by in the British establishments. And so they started thinking, well, maybe the Sikhism we were practicing was, influenced too much by Hinduism. And so we have to purify, Sikhism from all these, horrible polytheistic influences. And so what they did is that, they threw out the baby with the bathwater. And so, so they changed the canon of the Sikh tradition. They also changed some of the rituals. They got rid of the traditional, musical system that was used before. Because what happened also is that this movement rose around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. So there was a lot of, the sort of like communist hatred of hierarchy and classical culture. So instead of kirtan, which is the traditional religious music that you find in many Indian religious traditions, not just Sikhism, used to be played with sitar and dilruba and esraj and all these other wonderful classical Indian instruments. And what happened is that when the reformists took over, it was all replaced with the harmonium that the Christian missionaries had brought along. Actually, the harmonium has a very interesting history. It was brought by the missionaries, and then it landed in the brothels. And through some mysterious circumstances from the brothels, it landed in the Sikh temples, in the Sufi shrines, and the Hindu temples. I don't know how that happened, but hey. So, and the harmonium is just not suited for classical Hindustani music. You cannot play the microtones on it. You cannot play certain alankars or like certain decorative patterns that you have to use in classical Hindustani music. And so that has basically almost destroyed the classical musical tradition of the Sikhs, except that in the last 20 years, it's been resurfacing, right? And that's the wonderful thing about it. And so for the Sikh reformists, the Sikh gurus, the founders of the Sikh tradition are just basically social reformers, right? Whereas for traditional Sikhism, Guru Nanak and Guru Gobind Singh and all the other, all the other gurus, there are 10 gurus of the Sikh tradition, they're avatars, they're manifestations of God, right? And so there are theological differences between the traditional Sikhs and then the reformist Sikhs. And there's also differences in the canon. There's also differences in terms of the way that they wear the 5 Ks, the 5 attributes of the Khalsa Sikhs. Like, for example, Nihangs, who are the warriors in the Sikh tradition, really place a lot of emphasis on the fact that the kirpan, the sword or dagger that you have to wear has to be a real weapon, and that you should be able to use it. Whereas majority of reformist Sikhs just have a very symbolic type of butter knife thing that they wear on the side of, and they don't even know how to use it. So yeah. So these are some of the main differences. And also what's really important is that apart from myself and Baba Kamarup Singh, there was this other man who appeared in the Midlands. His name is Nadar Singh. Nadar Singh is a martial artist, and he's also part of the Nihang tradition, so the warrior saints of Sikhism. And he's one of the only living masters of the traditional Northern Indian battle arts. So he knows all of the moves. He's an excellent martial artist. I mean, God knows me and him have a complicated relationship, but I'll say that. I mean, in terms of, in the martial arts world, he's a very respected authority on Northern Indian battle arts. And so you study under him, not so much in order to win competitions. You learn how to defend yourself and how to use swords and shields and daggers and spears and all of the other stuff. And of course, for the young people, the second generation Sikhs from the Midlands, that was like, wow, none of this like symbolic, stick fighting stuff from the reformist Gurdwara. We get to actually we get to learn the real stuff. And Nadar Singh attracted a lot of that youth that was interested in the old ways. And of course, it also came along around that period where movies like, The Last Samurai and, what's that other movie called? the one about the Crusades. I can't remember the name anymore. But yeah, so that sort of revival of epic movies inspired a lot of young kids to basically learn the old ways, and that was it's quite fascinating. So yeah, it's interesting, the sort of interaction between my own scholarship and then the emergence of that neo-traditionalist movement in the UK, which also then helped the re-emergence of these traditions in India as well. It's interesting. Yeah.
And what's the state of this re-emergence at the current time?
Now it's very strong. It's very, very strong. I mean, so especially the Nahangs have their own gurdwaras now in the UK. They have a strong presence. Nobody can intimidate them anymore. I mean, that's also the case in India as well. And what's also very interesting is even in India is that the Nahangs are no longer in survival mode because they were persecuted during the British period. And so up until recently, Nahangs were normally very uneducated people but who kept the tradition alive. Now what you're seeing in India is university-educated young men joining the Nahangs. And so this gives me a very great deal of hope in terms of a proper renewal of the Sikh tradition, because with traditional Sikhism comes also the sense of rediscovering the educational policies that Guru Gobind Singh, the last master of the Sikhs, had created for his disciples, because most of his disciples were Jats, were farmers from the Punjab. And what he did is that he created this sort of educational system where even the sons of Jats and sons and daughters of Jats would be able to learn Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, classical music, and so on and so forth. Which is one of the things that really attracted me to the personality of Guru Gobind Singh, was basically giving access to anyone, giving access to this elite education. And that is just wonderful. And so my PhD was also mostly about the order of scholars known as the Nirmalas were mostly sons of Jats, and the Jats are traditionally still considered Shudras within the traditional Indian caste system. So they're not allowed to learn Sanskrit normally. So what they would do is they would dress as sadhus, go to Benares, learn Sanskrit, and then come back to Punjab and then teach Sanskrit to the wider Sikh community. So much so that just before the invasion of the Punjab by the British, there's a German report about education in the Punjab stating very clearly that Punjabis were amongst the most educated people in India, with most people knowing something like 2-3 languages and having access to not just Sanskrit but also medicine. The best astrolabes at that time were being manufactured in Lahore, believe it or not. So that was quite remarkable, and I think that was made possible thanks to Guru Gobind Singh, who was a visionary. I think that the last great visionary of a tremendous magnitude. Of course, there were other great minds like Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda, but so there's these guys. But then that Guru Gobind Singh was someone who really wanted to initiate something extraordinary that would really transform that society and give people access to this wonderful classical education.
You mentioned that PhD, you said, is a process that is riddled with guilt, and that you finished it wounded in some ways. I can imagine after such an undertaking, oh, gosh, I mean, what do you do next? Did you have a clear sense of direction when you came out of that program? I know you went on to teach in various institutions. What was the state of your mind, of your spiritual side, for example, and also your academic trajectory as you came to an end of that PhD?
Yeah. Well, so academically speaking, I was drifting more and more towards the Persian world and in Iranian Shi'ism because of the work of the French philosopher Henri Corbin, who would spend 6 months in Paris teaching at the Sorbonne and then 6 months in Tehran, uncovering all of this, amazing Iranian philosophy and sort of, bring it to life again because, the secularist sort of tendencies of the Iranian state at that moment was that, this was absolutely worthless and that we all have to be, LARPing as, Germans and, so he enabled, this sort of rediscovery of Iranian philosophy, and I actually really fell in love with that, with his work. And in 2007, I did my first trip to Iran, and I absolutely fell in love with the country. It's literally love at first sight. I mean, I love India, and it will always be, but there's something about Iran that is just breathtaking. It's such a of course, the architecture, the classical music, the poetry. I mean, the Persian poets are absolutely, wonderful. Hafiz, Rumi, Saadi, Ferdowsi are absolutely amazing, not just poets, but also thinkers and philosophers in their own right. But what I admired the most was just the natural grace of the people. The Iranians are extremely graceful people in terms of the everyday manners that they have. There's a sweetness about Iranian culture that I really appreciate. The attention that is being given to preserve the other person's honor, right? And just this love for culture. I mean, you even working class people are, you'll find them recite entire pages of Hafiz while they're driving a taxi. And they're people who actually really love reading and classical music, and they're also very curious about the rest of the world. And and so I've, became quite addicted to going to Iran. I went 2008, 2009, and then I spent an entire year basically in 2015 working there and experiencing life the way that Iranians experience life, right? Yeah, that's the other half of my academic academic and spiritual journey as well, because by 2007 I basically embraced Shi'ism as a path, and then in 2009 I was initiated into an Iranian Shi'i Sufi order, but then I had to distance myself from it because of its conflict with the authorities, and for a person like me, that would be a bit too dangerous, because you don't want to find yourself in Iran and being suspected of being involved in internal political intra-Iranian disputes. You don't want that, and so I distanced myself from the order, even though I like them very much. But it's just that I've got enough troubles in my life on top of these other things. But yeah, so this is where the Iranian part of my Indo-Iranian studies thing basically took shape, and I'm very happy that I was able to become fluent in Persian, and also have access to this traditional culture that still has been preserved. I mean, Iranians have been able to preserve their traditional culture, and most importantly, their mystical schools of well, the mystical circle still exists, right? So you outside of the clergy and in the form of the Sufi orders, the Shi'i Sufi orders, such as the Nimatulaiya, the Khaksar, the Zahabiyya, but also within the clergy, believe it or not, but within the clergy, you have an underground mystical sort of circle that still exists to this day. And so it's just fascinating to see how it all survived up until today, and how it actually still nourishes the Iranian people in terms of their spirituality. It's fascinating.
I wonder if you might say a little more about your decision to convert to Islam.
Oh, well, I wouldn't call it a conversion. I would, because for me, conversion means that you've alchemically converted your lower self into something, and I'm very far from it. I'm still someone who has a lot to work. I still have a lot to work on. So, but let's just say that it's I've embraced a method. I look at religion the way that Bruce Lee looked at martial arts. So Bruce Lee was brought up with Wing Chun, right? But then at the same time, he had this amazing background as a cha-cha dancer, which influenced a lot of his footwork. And so, and then he recognized that, well, Wing Chun being the type of kung fu that was taught to nuns, of course, it comes with its advantages, but also its limitations. So he compensated wherever he saw weaknesses or things that were not, that were not suited for him. He would look into other martial arts traditions, and that's exactly what I've done. So as a personal practice, I've found that 12 Shi'ism gives me that sort of individual discipline that I needed in my spiritual life, whilst combining it with meditation and other things that I found in other spiritual traditions that I find valuable. So I still remain a very interesting heretic, whatever religion I join in. But yeah, so I don't like the word conversion so much, and also because I think that a lot of people, and that's also been my experience in all of these years, is that I think one needs to be aware of what I call the limits of universalism. People are not blank slates that you can sort of like refill with a new program. And so you cannot convert someone the way you convert a Word document to a PDF. It just doesn't work like that. Culturally, I'm European, and I'll always be culturally Catholic. And may I add, like a Heidenchrist, a Pagano-Christian, and that will always be the case. But there's also the fact, and I think a lot of people, a lot of Europeans who convert to non-European faith tend to forget that, is that people may go with the best intentions, in their minds into another religious tradition. But then there's sociology. And you may find 12 Shi'ism to be fantastic. You may find Sikhism to be fantastic. You might find some forms of Hinduism to be fantastic. Great. But from a sociological point of view, the question is, will these people accept you as one of their own? And that's where the wall of basically sociological reality hits these converts. Sikhism is wonderful. It's a wonderful tradition. I was ready to take Amrit, but then there's the reality of the caste system. And the caste system means that as a convert, it's going to be almost impossible for you to find a spouse that takes religion actually seriously. You may find some liberal like upper middle class liberal girl from Chandigarh, or a second generation girl from from the Midlands who might accept you, but then her knowledge of Sikhism will be vastly inferior to yours, and then you'll be seen as just too extreme, basically, right? So there's that. And there's also the fact that, especially when it comes to 12 Shi'ism, is that, Iran is in the political situation it is now. And European converts are seen as potential spies. So as I always tell people, it's a great personal practice. But in terms of the community, because of the present circumstances, there's a toxicity that basically I can do without, and which is why I don't frequent mosques. I don't go to Hussainiyas, which are other types of religious buildings in the Shia tradition. And I'm very careful about my interactions with people, because I know that behind the politeness, there's this whole baggage that comes from colonial history and so on and so forth that, makes people ask, well, why did he join us, and so on and so forth. And in the past, it used to anger me, and now I'm just like, okay, you guys do your thing, right? I do my thing, and that's it. And, and I'm quite happy in my sort of like, Neoplatonic Vajrayana Shi'ism sort of synthesis. That is basically my own responsibility, and I don't impose it on others, and I'm very discreet about it. I mean, I live here in Iraq. My students at university don't know I'm Shia. They just assume that I'm some sort of Christian or whatever. 2 years ago, I went on a visitation of the shrine of Imam Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, in Karbala, and 2 of my students were there, and they were like, "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'm visiting Imam Hussein." "But you're Christians." Like, "Oh, well, it's complicated." And so you learn with the interactions with the communities, that that there are limits to universalism, and that also there's the fact that a lot of religion in this part of the world is so politicized that any discussion on mysticism will be perceived as a threat. So you just like, okay, you guys do your own thing, and I don't get involved in that, and I do my thing,
Why is discussion of mysticism perceived as a threat?
Well, because it's the Pandora's box of Shi'ism, because Shi'ism is a tradition that initially was born as a mystical and esoteric tradition. So Shi'ism goes back to the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. So his name is Imam Ali. So Imam Ali is seen as, in early Shi'ism, not just as the key to the esoteric dimension of Islam, but in a lot of very early circles, he's seen as an avatar, as a manifestation of God. And that, of course, is in complete contradiction with mainstream Sunni Islam. And on what happened with the history of Shi'ism is that, because Shi'ism was a persecuted community from the very get-go, the outer circle of the disciples of the Shia divine guides, the 12 Imams, basically started to water down the tradition, the mystical tradition, and to transform it into a legalistic jurisprudential thing, which is basically, mainstream 12 Shi'ism nowadays, which is of course also very political. And that's the result of a survival mechanism, because it was either that or having your head chopped off, or basically living in the mountains and pretending that you were Christians or whatever. So this sort of like outer anti-mystical Shi'ism was, which was initially a survival mechanism, sort of became the mainstream over time. And so that every time you mention mysticism, and then you bring out the old sources, it's just people basically lose their, they lose, some people lose their minds. It's more the case here in Iraq. In Iran, I mean, people are pretty much cool with it, because a lot of people within the establishment are into philosophy and Neoplatonic philosophy. So that's why in Iran it's not such a problem. But outside of Iran, it's a no-go zone, and so you don't talk about it. But yeah, so in Iran you have these apart from the mainstream Shias, you have all these other groups that still adhere to the primordial Shia tradition, where the Imam Ali is seen just like Christ as a manifestation of God, as an avatar. And so therefore also the relationship to the divine law, to the Sharia, is also very different. So you have some groups that, for example, don't pray the canonical laws, prayers, for example. Other groups that use music and dancing as part of their worship, which is not at all accepted in mainstream Shiism. But in Iran, there's this tolerance for it, and also because these people have contributed a great deal to Iran's classical culture. So they're sort of they're seen as like eccentrics, but they're part of the cultural and religious landscape of Iran. So they're they're not bothered much by the clergy. So that's fine, and they actually also have sympathizers within the clergy as well. So that's good. But in Iraq, that's not the case.
You said Neoplatonism, and you talked about Vajrayana and so on. I think we might have to do a sequel to talk about what you've discovered about Shi'ism, mysticism, and Vajrayana, because that really deserves its own episode, I think. But Neoplatonism, I wonder if you might say something about the influence of Neoplatonism on Muslim mysticism, Muslim philosophy, etc.
Well, I mean, you cannot. So here's the thing. So the two main branches of of Greek philosophy, so Aristotelism and basically Neoplatonism, have been extremely important for the development of Islamic philosophy. And in the Islamic West, that culminated with Aristotelicism culminated with Ibn Rushd, with Averroes, right? And then it ends there. But Islamic philosophy still continues in the East, in Iran in particular, and that's where Neoplatonism is so important. Because here's what something that a lot of people forget is that Iran is one of the only places on earth where you have a living tradition of Neoplatonism, with masters that can very legitimately state that their chain of transmission goes all the way to Plotinus. Because what happened is during the Byzantine Empire, the academy in Athens had been shut down by the emperor, and so the entire school moved to the Sasanian Iranian Empire in Ctesiphon, the capital of the empire, which is actually just half an hour away from my house, and it's in the south of Baghdad. Because the capital of the Persian Empire was actually in here in Iraq. And so what you have is an entire school of Eastern Neoplatonism that developed here, and that was developed by the Nestorians, but also by the Iranians here. And so, of course, when Shi'ism came, this entire Greek heritage was soaked up by Shi'ism. And that's why my mentor, Professor Amir Moezi, who took over the position of Henri Corbin at the Sorbonne, very clearly states that, Shi'ism, and especially the figure of Imam Ali, has been the vessel through which late antique Greek, sapiental traditions, but also Eastern, Iranian, like Mithraic and Zoroastrian traditions were basically saved, in the figure of Imam Ali. So that, one can very legitimately say that Iranian Shi'ism, in its philosophical and mystical form, is the last living remnant of and living tradition, actually, of Neoplatonism. I mean, someone like, Sheikh Jabari Abuli, who's a teacher in Qom, and a great philosopher, he's basically a Neoplatonist. He can legitimately claim that he has a lineage of teachers going back to Plotinus, which is, just, amazing. And what is even, I think, more touching is that when you see these men walk around the shrines, because very often what they do, they still do this whole, very, very, ancient Greek thing of teaching in temples and so on and so forth. So Sheikh Jabari Amuli, after the dawn prayers, he teaches in one of the side mosques of the shrine of Lady Masuma in Qom. And you see him just basically, in his mantle, in his Jedi outfit, basically, walk without any bodyguards, and just the respect that is manifest, and the people just stand up and bow down to greet him. It's quite amazing. And then, for hours, it's discussing basically mystical philosophy, but also, methods of mystical practice, which is quite amazing. And that's still alive. And I think that's the beauty, really, of the Iranian tradition, is that all of that is still alive. And then when I look at someone like Sheikh Jabari Amoli, I have the impression of looking at at the Plato or the Plotinus of our age, and it's not just in terms of knowledge, but actually in terms of just the aura that people like that exude, really. And what I'm trying really to say is it's the sort of reverence that we find in the old Sanskrit text for the figure of the Guru, the Gurudev, this. And this is something I really cherish, and it's still there, and it's still alive, despite all of the shopping malls and fast food chains that have been opening up in the country. It's still alive, and it's yeah.
I wonder if you might describe some of the Neoplatonic features that you see still clearly visible, perhaps in terms of doctrinal emphasis or practice, orientation, etc.
Oh yeah. So first of all, there's the how to call it, the cosmology is very Neoplatonic. So you have the one, right? And then from the one you have all these other levels of creation that have less and less and less reality and light to them, right? And so our world is described in Arabic as the mulk, that's the material world. And then above it you have the malakut, which is the angelic world. And above it the jabarut and the lahut, which are the divine. So the lahut is the divine world, and the jabarut is the world of the divine attributes. But what's really interesting is that the malakut, the celestial or the angelic world, is also known as the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. It's the world where pure spirit takes on form and where matter becomes spiritualized. It's the equivalent of the Sambhogakaya and of the Bardo in many ways. And this world, which basically disappeared from European philosophy because of Aristotle or Aristotelicism, this world, the very existence of this world, enables one to explain, what mystical visions are, and also explains how and why, for example, phenomena like lucid dreaming or out of body travel and so on and so forth how they can basically be possible in the first place, right? And so and that's only possible because Islamic philosophy, and especially Iranian Islamic philosophy, has continued this Neoplatonic, cosmology, where the mundus imaginalis still exists. In fact, Henri Corbin actually wrote an entire essay about the importance of the imaginal world, and that he says that the great gift that Iran can give to the world, and especially to Europe, is the rediscovery of the imaginal world that we have lost because of Aristotelicism, and also because of according to him, the Council of Constantinople. Because before the Council of Constantinople, the human being was divided into soma, the body, pneuma, the soul, and then the spirit, right? And so with the Second Council of Constantinople, this threefold division was reduced to a twofold division. So you have the body versus the spiritual soul. So when you do that, you basically eliminate the imaginal world from the map. It's like having a map of the world where you've just removed, I don't know, China or Russia, and so you're left with an incomplete, map of things. And this is where, especially in Western Europe, we have so many difficulties explaining the visions of mystics. What are they? How is it that, someone like Hildegard of Bingen can have these visions and these amazing mandala structures? Where do these come from, right? Well, you can explain that if you have a notion of the mundus imaginalis, right, of the imaginal world. But if you don't, then, then maybe it's the devil, or maybe, or you're mad, or whatever. With the notion of the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, you're able to explain the existence of these phenomena and work with them in your spiritual life, and that's extremely useful. Yeah, and that's one of the features. And of course, the entirety of Iranian Islamic arts is based entirely on Plotinus. There's no theory of Iranian Islamic art without Plotinus. And in fact, I developed a course, that I've kept teaching for several years, called Introduction to the Aesthetic Traditions of Islam. And a great portion of it is basically us reading Plotinus, and looking at how Plotinus has this amazing influence upon not just Islamic philosophers, and especially the Eastern Islamic philosophers, but also on Islamic art. Because, the use of geometry and fractals in Islamic art has to do with the notion of the imaginal world, the world of images. You wouldn't have that if you didn't have this Greek heritage that upon which Islamic philosophy was built upon. And and this is where I always emphasize the fact that Europe and Iran share this common Greek heritage, which translated itself in very different ways. But I think they're complementary, and both can really learn from one another.
Did the metempsychosis doctrine survive at all in Islamic philosophy, or in certain Islamic mystical circles?
Yeah, in mystical Shi'ism, it survived. So you have mainstream Shi'ism, mainstream 12 Shi'ism, and then you have these little groups that still hold on to the primordial tradition, and many of them still have basically metempsychosis, like the Alawis of Syria, who are being butchered now by Giuliani and his men. You have the Al-Haq, the Yarsan tradition in Kurdistan. These are people who believe that the divinity manifests in cyclical ways throughout human history, and that basically you're supposed to come back to this world until you've completely finished your spiritual journey, after which basically you'll be reunited with the one. So so that exists as well. So certain Sufi orders, certain Shia Sufi orders in Iran have some, references to metempsychosis, which they're very careful to articulate in such a way that it doesn't, it doesn't arouse the suspicion of the clergy, but it's still there. So you have this sort of dual system where you have a combination of a belief in reincarnation and a belief in a resurrection. So you keep on reincarnating until you've become, enlightened, and that's when and it's in that state that you basically resurrected, and then you basically go up with the one. So you have these systems, and they still exist, and they're still not just still alive, but they're getting a more and more popularity because in Iran, let's put it this way: a certain type of clergy has made sure that a certain percentage of the population would be interested in other forms of Shi'ism rather than their own, basically, if you get one drift. So I mean, this is something a lot of people don't get in especially in the Western media. It's not that young people in Iran have stopped being religious. They're very intensely religious. It's just that their religiosity has morphed in different ways. So in Iran, you have a great deal of interest in meditation and yoga. People, combine Shi'ism with yoga and meditations and so forth. There's even people who use psilocybin mushrooms as part of their religious practice. There's a great deal of stuff going on in Iran, so the Iranians like to experiment in terms of their religious life, it's one of the things that fascinates me so much about Iran. It's this ability of Iranian people to basically reshape their religious landscape on their own and just explore stuff. I really like that about them.
That metempsychosis doctrine you're describing there sounds so much like the what's described in Phaedrus, that reincarnation and the eventual reuniting with the one, in that great chariot race to the rim of,
Yeah.
Would you say then, what would you say then if I was to accuse you? I'm just teasing, really. If I was to ask you, are you in a sense a Neo-Platonist at heart, and the resonances you have with the Shi'a tradition and that you still have with Catholicism, that you've mentioned these things, is the common thread there Neo-Platonism? Would you say that's where your spiritual home is in some kind of a way, or is that not quite right?
No, I think you are absolutely right. I've been a closeted Neoplatonist for all this time, and I've actually only very recently, admitted it to myself. I'm basically a Neoplatonism, and Shi'ism just happens. Iranian 12 Shi'ism in its mystical form happens to be a path that enables me to live that tradition, and whilst at the same time keeping my European and pagan and Catholic roots, whilst establishing these bonds of brotherhoods with the other members of the Indo-Germanic peoples, and that's wonderful. It makes me feel at home. I mean, last year I traveled to Pakistan to with my great friend, Dr. Walid Ziyad, and we went to see this wonderful, absolutely stunningly beautiful Buddhist site in called Takht Bai in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where the Pashtuns live. And it's one of these. It's a Wagnerian site. It's in a slope of a mountain, and it's got this sort of like, you know, German fortress vibe to it, you know. And that's actually it's in one of these. It's in that monastery where you find some of the earliest examples of dark retreat rooms that, you know, that are there. And so, of course, after the visit, we went to see some of the farmers who also sell some of the artifacts that they find, you know, as they're working the lands. And I've found out, I was talking to my cousins, and there's such a commonality in terms of, I mean, I think it has to do with you know, ancestry. I could feel this bond, this Indo-European bond between us, and the fact that, you know, we were all just, you know, enjoying this Buddhist heritage, which itself also had traces of Neoplatonism as well. So yeah, I'm philosophically speaking definitely a Neoplatonist, and 12 Iranian Shi'ism just happens to be the tradition that has still kept that tradition alive as its main philosophical expression, and this helped me a great deal in terms of finding my place, you know. And I'm ethnically Iberian, culturally I'm definitely, you know, Germanic because of my upbringing. But spiritually, I'm an Indo-European, and that expresses itself in this overarching philosophical school that is Neoplatonism, that has transcended the limits of Greece, has traveled to Iran and actually even beyond. And and it's now that I'm 50 years old, I'm realizing all of this, and I'm very grateful for this journey, because I mean, my first love when I was 8 years old was classical Greece, you know. In fact, for Carnival, when I was 11 years old, I dressed up as Plato. Yeah. My brother dressed up as someone else, but I won't mention it here because you know, there might be some problems. I can tell you that in private, but yeah, he got into a bit of trouble. But yeah, so it's yeah. So I find myself in this amazing, you know, place where I can you know, keep my love for Homer and the Iliad, whilst also, you know, finding inspiration in the Bhagavad Gita, and all that's possible because of that overarching, you know, structure that is, you know, that Neoplatonism provides to me. So that's, yeah. So your intuition was absolutely correct. Yeah.
That's so fascinating indeed, I must say. And you know, you're edging towards now a line of questioning that when you talk about Indo-European and discoveries you're making, these research you're conducting about in which you're comparing Vajrayana with Islamic mystical techniques and philosophies and practices, etc. And it's been so interesting to hear you describe some of that in our private correspondences, and I think it deserves its own episode. I think we've set something up here with this bombshell revelation of your Neoplatonism. I'm just jesting, of course. I think it sets the stage very nicely for a description of that work. I wonder if you might say something, just a few lines maybe, to give us a hint of what we're looking forward to for the sequel.
Oh, yeah. So basically, it's the fact that so whilst Tibetan Buddhism has this wonderful tradition of dream yoga, I recently stumbled upon this 4-volume edition from the 19th century. This 4-volume, work from the 19th century, written by a Shiite Hadith scholar from Najaf of Iranian origin, that deals with lucid dreaming practices in Shi'ism. And not only do they share a lot of things in terms of their, their let's say, cosmological worldview, in a sense that, in the Iranian world, these dreams take place in the barzakh, or in the imaginal world. In Tibetan Buddhism, it'd be the bardo, right? But some of the practices are almost identical. Like, for example, the position of the body, when you're going to when you go to sleep. The fact that you have daytime practices as well that you perform in order to be able to induce these lucid dreams. Because here's the thing: in 941 AD, the last Imam of the Shia, the last spiritual guide of the Shia, or divine guide of the Shia, goes into occultation. He disappears. So where does a Shia receive his, spiritual guidance from? And the answer is, well, you do that through lucid dreaming. You can contact the living Imam of the time by, practicing lucid dreaming. And you can also see Imam Ali or the Prophet or Lady Fatima and receive teachings from them through lucid dreaming. And what's really interesting, though, is that in the Tibetan canon, you have a mention of Jabir ibn Hayyan, who in the West is known as Geber, the father of chemistry and alchemy. Well, Jabir ibn Hayyan was a disciple of the 6th Shiite Imam, Jafar Sadiq. So, but in the Tibetan text is known as Jabir the Yogi. And so what this means is that between the 8th and the 10th century, you have these exchanges happening along the Silk Road, where I think Udhyana is the center where these exchanges all take place. And so what you have is this sort of Bruce Lee type mystics who really don't care about denomination, and who are learning from one another and exchanging techniques and so on and so forth. And then it just branches out into Tibetan Buddhism, Kashmiri Shaivism, Gorakpanti, Shaivism, and then the mystical traditions that still exist within Iranian Sufism and Iranian Shi'ism. And it's not just that. Like, you have, like, for example, a great Shiite philosopher by the name of Allama Tabatabai, was also a great mystic. So in one of his works, he writes the following. He says, well, every day you should retire for half an hour into a quiet room in your house, close your eyes, and visualize the letter A, Aleph, as in golden light, and focus all of your thoughts, your mental flow, basically on that. I'm like, hello, that's the Ajikan meditation technique from Shingon Buddhism. So of course the obvious link here is Udhyana. It's the birthplace of all these like tantric meditation techniques, and so westwards it goes into the Iranian world in the form of Iranian Sufism and mystical Shi'ism, and then eastwards it just goes into Tibetan Buddhism, but also Shingon Buddhism. So you have these things going on, and there's actually more to all of that. For example, well, the notion of Bayul, for example, of these sacred, hidden lands, and you have them in Shi'ism as well. I mean, you have these people who are being persecuted by the authorities, and then suddenly they find themselves in this mysterious land where they stay for several months, under the protection of the Imam of the time. And they're, I mean, you have several of these things. And I think it has to do with the fact that, a lot of it comes from Udhyana, and also the fact that, Shi'ism itself absorbed a lot of it, especially Eastern Shi'ism, like in the region of Mashhad. Like, for example, a lot of these Buddhist shrines where you have, the feet of the Buddha that are basically sculpted on the ground, they've become Shiite shrines. So they're no longer the feet of Buddha, but they're the feet of Imam Ali or Imam Rida, for example. So contrary to other forms of Islam that basically just destroyed the pre-Islamic heritage, Shi'ism incorporated all of that and Shi'ified it, and so that I suspect that a lot of people who converted to Shi'ism around that time just saw the 12 Shiite imams as like Buddhas of the West, But yeah, these practices of like dream yoga exist also in 12 Shi'ism, and it was very popular in the 19th century actually. And well, nowadays because of the politicization of Shi'ism, that sort of has disappeared. But the texts are there, and they're very they're very clear. And then of course there's along with the meditation on the letter A, there are very interesting references to what looks like Tummo in the poetry of Hafiz. So Hafiz was, was this amazing Sufi master who was also a poet and who wrote this amazing diwan of poetry. And spread throughout his poetry, you have these references to, the meditation on the letter A, which is part of Tummo. You have references to mystical heats. You have references to the red master that you find in the heart, the red-colored master that you find in the heart. You have, of course, also references to the mastery of the breath, and I mean all of that stuff, and which is one of the reasons why I want to find someone with whom I could actually learn Tummo, so that I can reread Hafiz through that sort of lens, because and also because I feel that for my own lucid dreaming practice, I should first have a sort of like introduction to Tummo practice. So any of you out there who will be willing to help me on that, your help is most welcome. But yeah, there's a lot of that going on. A lot of these exchanges are going on, and the thing is, the smoking gun is the reference to Jabir ibn Hayyan in the Tibetan canon. I don't remember if it's the Tanjur or the Kanjur, but it's one either. It's one of these two collections of text. But Jabir is there, and it's referenced as Jabir the Yogi, which is quite remarkable. And so yeah. And the good thing is that we're starting again to have these sort of Bruce Lee type, scholar practitioners who are exchanging, techniques and advices and so forth. That's quite fast. I think we're now in a sweet spot where all of this thing is happening.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, let's come back and talk about that in more detail. If you're up for that, that would be really interesting indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
This has been just so great. Dr. Francisco José Luis, thank you very much.
Thank you. Very honored.
Obrigado. Muito bem. Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.